There we go. Oh my goodness, Jason. Good morning. You know, my espresso machine is broken. And I think like my Brevo, my really nice espresso machine. And I think I probably needed another shot this morning because we clearly failed at trying to go live on YouTube. Um, Show us that picture, your profile avatar icon. Okay, so I asked you immediately, are these llama or alpaca? And you told me, no, they're not. Tell us again, because this is fascinating.
So these are Wanakos. They are in the canelid family. They're related to camels and llamas. These particular individuals are located. They live on the Bolivian Altiplano, which is basically like an elevated grassland at 12 to 15,000 feet in the Andes Mountains, and these just beautiful guys. They are their fur is very soft,
Oh, so
and
you touched one.
I did not touch one.
Okay.
Um,
You can just
they're-
imagine you chasing them.
yeah,
And
no, their fur is very soft. It's very prized, and there are some sustainable efforts to harvest some of the fur, but they are wild populations, and so they're every sort of once a year or so, a whole community of people with NGOs and local communities and farmers get together and kind of herd them all together or herd groups of them together and do some shearing and then sort of let them go again. It's sort of a conservation, a sustainable harvesting approach, right? To
right.
enrich the local economies there, which of course they don't make a lot of money in that area for the farmers.
And you can't let them go without shearing. I just saw that video of the sheep that lived in the wild for all
Right. They
those years
just,
and it had
yeah, they
65
get a ton of
pounds
stuff.
of wool and they had to shear it.
Yeah. Now, these three in particular, okay, I was riding my bike on the Bolivian Altiplano, between 12 and 15,000 feet, and it was an expansive area. There were some storms that were coming through, and so you could see like pretty ominous clouds in the distance and some lightning bolt strikes happening. And I was kind of like looking for an area to hunker down and camp for the night. And I just like got this feeling like somebody was watching me. And I kid you not, Lori, I like turned over my right shoulder and the three of those guys were just like right there, like
Wow.
20, 25 feet like off of the side of the road, just like looking straight at me. And I hadn't seen any yet, and so I was like very excited. So I took a couple pictures of them, and
Did you
uh,
get a selfie?
I didn't get a selfie. It was like like a legit camera that I took a photo of them. I actually have two brothers, so there's kind of like I'm one of three brothers. So I kind of like whenever the group of the three of them always kind of reminds me of my brothers and my trip, and they're just a fun. They're just so adorable.
That's
So
awesome.
yeah,
So, welcome to Animal Planet, everyone.
yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
Coach Lorri Lown with Coach Jason Aloisio today. This is the Team Wilpers Let's Pivot onto Zoom challenge since I couldn't go live. And so we're going to record for you today. So Jason's a really interesting person. I am very excited about this. This is probably the first PhD in biology that I've ever interviewed. I always think I'm fancy because I have an MBA and I'm like, oh, cool. I'm a cycling coach with an MBA. That's unique and cool. But Jason, I was reading about him this morning, has an 11-page CV, but the last page is all cycling, mountain bike racing primarily, right? A little tiny bit of triathlon. So, and one thing he doesn't mention in his CV is he's an Eagle Scout. So, for those of you in the Boy Scouts, that is the highest honor. It is a huge achievement. In Girl Scouting, that would be the Gold Award. And so it takes a lot of commitment, multi-years, to do something like that. I
Were
gave him
you
a
were
nickname
you a Girl
in
Scout
my
as well,
mind.
Lori, or
But
were you a Girl Scout
I was a
as
Girl
well?
Scout leader. I was a Girl Scout for 3 years. And then I went to junior high school because I was from the East Coast, from New York as well. And I walked into the office in my junior high school, like the geek that I was, and I said, "When is the Girl Scout meeting?" And they laughed at me.
Mhm.
because I didn't realize Girl Scouting was not necessarily part of the school. And by the time you get to the cadet level, which is the middle school age, not quite as popular. And so Girl
Mhm.
Scouting ended for me.
Mm.
But then in my early 20s, I became a Girl Scout leader for 9 years. I worked with a group of girls when they were 8 and 9 years old, and eventually all the way through high school. And my co leader was dad. So we were a little non traditional. We didn't make crafts, we did
Love that.
service mostly.
Amazing. That's
Yeah.
great.
It was, and I'm still friends with many of the, like, Facebook has been a great way to reconnect with many of the girls that were in my troop. So, um,
It's a
now,
great youth development program. Scouting,
oh,
Girl Scouts, Boy
absolutely.
Scouts, Explorer Scouts. Great, great youth development program.
Now, is that when you first developed your love and appreciation of nature?
Um, Not sure if that was, I think from the moment I think my mom likes to tell the story that I would at 3 years old, I would be outside playing in the sandbox just like all day, outside all day, and I would come inside and I would be so tan that she thought I was dirty and she would be like scrubbing my back and my neck because I was like so tan because I'm half Italian. I'm not particularly tan right now, but I get pretty dark as the summer progresses. So I think from I think it's in my genes to be outside and about and just a very active person. I've been a very active person my entire life, ton of energy, and so I've always loved being outside for as long as I can remember.
Right.
And
Well,
scouts
riding bikes will allow you to do that. It's not
and
a
and
chore
riding
thing
bikes
ever.
from BMX. I started on a BMX bike, and actually, my mom, the way I started riding a bike was no training wheels.
Good for you.
I'm against my mom was against training wheels. I'm against training wheels. My mom literally just would run with me on my first Huffy I got for Christmas when I was, I don't know, 5, 7, 6, something like that. She would just run with me on the grass,
Right.
holding me up, and I would fall a couple times, and then she would have, let go, and there I was riding a bike. I started riding a bike very, very young and then got into BMX and was like really into building jumps. There was a BMX park right across the street from where I grew up. So I spent a ton of time building jumps and riding jumps and doing that whole thing for years until I became a teenager. And then I got into mountain biking because we
Mhm.
also had a lot of mountain bike trails around me.
Where
And
did you grow up, Jason?
I grew up out on Long Island in New
Okay.
York, east of the city, about New York City, about an hour and a half,
As opposed to San Francisco.
as
I
opposed to
grew
San
up in
Francisco.
upstate New York
Yeah.
and like really upstate New York, not Westchester, Putnam, but Elmira. And you raced in Cortland, I saw, which is very close to
Oh
years
yeah,
ago.
yeah. I must have. Yeah, yeah.
You
Years
were young.
ago.
It was early in your racing career. Yeah.
I
I always
do.
think of, the city. There's no nature, there's no wild there, but there actually is. And especially when you get out into the boroughs and Long Island and yeah.
Yeah, and so some of my PhD work actually pushes back on that notion about there being no nature in cities. And
Right.
if there is nature, I mean, I mean, I think conventionally we sort of think that in highly built areas there's no nature, but that couldn't be further from the truth, right?
Mhm.
Because wherever you are in an urban environment, there's still the actual environment around you, right? I mean, we along with a big research group, I've been conducting urban ecology, which is ecology in urban areas for a decade and a half, and there's incredible diversity of species within urban areas still. For example, plants. There's like 2 to 3 thousand different species of plants that are in New York City. There's hundreds of different of ant species. Um, you know, there are
I thought you
coyotes.
were going to say animal species, and I'm thinking rats and raccoons and coyote. Do you have coyotes in New York City? We have
We
a
absolutely
coyote issue out here.
we absolutely have coyotes in New York
Okay.
City. Yep, yep. Deer, right, are around as well. And yeah, certainly that human nature interaction has in many ways been the core of my academic research is thinking about humans and nature and their interactions. And they're inextricably linked.
Mm-hmm.
So and in urban environments is a very concentrated, interesting laboratory where we can really study those interactions in a variety of different ways. So
Right.
there's lots of nature in cities,
If you open your eyes.
if you open your eyes, cracks and corners, crevices, and even big parks and
Mm-hmm.
small parks, there's a ton of diversity in cities, and we rely upon that nature in cities.
Right.
One of the aspects of cities and urban ecology that I focused on was stormwater retention. So basically, when you take a natural environment and you pave it over with buildings and roads, it changes the hydrology, the hydrological dynamics pretty substantially because water basically hits and then is runs off into the surrounding waterways and can cause pollution
Mm-hmm.
and flooding and all kinds of issues. And so one of my focuses of research is creating green rooftops where you put growing media, soil, and plants, and they act as sponges there to capture the stormwater, slow it down from running into the surrounding environment, and creating new habitat space for new animals. And we've done research on bats and birds and insects that all increase in abundance and diversity when you have green roofs
Right.
and other sorts of pocket parks and other things. Now there's a lot of complexity to that still, but that's some broad strokes.
Right. So let me ask you a question. Here in San Francisco, we have the Presidio rooftop tunnels that are brand new. They just opened them. Is that an example of rooftop gardening?
I'm not sure I know what that is. Presidio rooftop.
So they built some tunnels
Are
through the
they?
Presidio to get to the Golden Gate Bridge. They rerouted traffic basically. Um, and because they've opened a lot of green space, Chrissy Field is now green space and wetlands. And so they put in this huge project. It took many years called the rooftop tunnels on top of, so it's on top of all the traffic tunnels instead of just making whatever open highway space. They've put garden space and animal space. And yeah, I thought you'd know every one of the rooftop tunnels.
Well, it's that
There's
as
probably a lot of that going on.
there, yeah. So I mean, it could be debatable whether or not it's considered a roof if it's a tunnel because the tunnel is
Oh,
subterranean. So,
yeah.
um, you know, we you can the exact definition of a roof is, yeah, I'm not sure that necessarily fits, but it certainly is in line with the idea of increasing green space in urban
Right.
areas for the ecosystem services that they provide.
Yeah.
Of course, there are always some disservices too
Mm-hmm.
associated with natural areas, right? And so you just said one of them, coyote, there's conflict too.
Mm-hmm.
There's potentially disease. And even things like trees, you think trees are like the most beneficial thing to have in urban spaces,
Mm-hmm.
but they're also limbs can drop on cars
Right.
and even coming back to cycling, things like sweet gum seeds or acorns
Right.
when there's a mast and you have a ton of them that are falling on the ground, it's like riding
Mm-hmm.
on marbles. It can be quite dangerous. So
So
um,
here we go. We'll loop back into cycling. But I
there's
could
always
talk
trade-offs.
about
There's always trade-offs between everything.
ecology for a long time. Go back to cycling. So you were riding BMX and then you started mountain biking.
Yeah, so I grew up riding BMX, love getting there, hitting jumps, doing all those things. And I think maybe when I was 13 or 14, I got my first mountain bike, 26-inch wheels, mongoose switchback, fully rigid,
No dropper,
no nothing.
no disc brakes.
Cantilever brakes. Yeah, three by what was it, like a 3x7 or a 3x8 at that point in time, right? 21 speed. So I think it was 3x7, right? And that was like the coolest thing ever. And we had like 25 miles of mountain bike trails at the Rocky Point that I could literally ride to from my door. It was about 20 minutes away. And so I just fell in love with mountain biking at that point, and I mean I've never let it go. And years later, in college, I started getting into road cycling with one of my best friends. Like, was like, "Oh, you need to road ride," and I was like, "Road riding? No way! I
Right.
want to be in the woods," But I got into road riding, and really, I love all forms of riding, no matter what
Mhm.
it is. I still ride jumps. I still have a BMX bike and go into the pump tracks and do that sort of thing. I still mountain bike. I ride my road bike a ton, obviously, and I like to do overnight trips as well, and go bike packing. So bikes are just, I love riding bikes. They're the most, for commuting, for exercise. I believe deeply in the transformative power of cycling for health, wellness, and personal growth.
Mhm.
And
And community,
and
there's a social
community,
aspect of it as well. It's
absolutely,
you can see things and smell things and feel things and hear things that you would never experience in a car. And you can
absolutely.
go to glamorous and exciting places like Merced, California, or Cortland, New York.
Yeah. Or just go out your back door, and there's always more to explore in the place where you are, right?
Mhm.
We're everything is cyclical. Everything is cyclical. So, what you see today is different than what you will see 6 months from now, and
Right.
so on and so forth. And so, you know, um, so I like to flip the grass is greener on the other side and say there's always more blades to there's always more blades of grass to look on in the field that you're at, you
Oh,
know?
that's a good quote. I may have to remember that one. I was
Yeah.
riding yesterday with a friend who is, she just had a baby, so 8 months old, and she's riding the AIDS ride in a couple of weeks. And she's trying to squeeze in some last minute endurance. And we're riding, and it's just amazing living here. And whenever I get down on the world, I have to remind myself that people pay to come here and enjoy the things that we get to do every day, the ocean, the trees, the everything. It's amazing. And people who live here don't always see it. It's like, do you go to Alcatraz if you live in San Francisco, or do you go to the Statue of Liberty? But this is nature, which is even better. So how did you transition from you had a big trip. Let's talk about that, because there's long rides, like things like Pelofondo, and people know about Everesting in the Peloton community, and bike touring we've all heard of, and bike packing. But you decided to take on a huge adventure. Tell us about that a little bit.
Yeah, so well, two things. So, as you mentioned, I have a PhD in biology,
Right.
and um, and I've always been an explorer at a variety of different scales. You know, I'm fascinated with the world. I want to learn about how everything works. I'm interested in exploring at the small level, at the personal level, at the landscape level. And that's one of my passions, exploring, learning. And then my other passion is teaching,
Yeah.
educating. And my sort of peer education began all the way back there when I was in Boy Scouts, when I was working with others, becoming a leader, peer leader, a near peer leader. And I've been in education for the past 20 years in
Hmm.
a variety of different, um, let's say, topic areas. Okay. And so a lot of my education focus has been in informal spaces rather than in traditional academic settings. And so my athletic coaching was something that has been a continuation of my evolving educational practice over the last 20 years.
Right.
Early on in my educational practice, I really focused on urban ecology education, urban agricultural education, and youth development and science research mentoring. And I've done some work in that area. I've received funding from the National Science Foundation. I've published peer-reviewed research papers on mentoring and environmental education. And uh, and as and while all that's going on, I'm still loving bikes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And being an adventurer on bikes. And I started to get into coaching right around the pandemic, about the same time as the rest of us, when things were shifting quite a bit in the world. Um, Actually, in 2019, I decided that I was going to take a leave of absence from the Wildlife Conservation Society, where I had been working for about 5 years after finishing my PhD, which is one of the world's largest conservation organizations. And I wanted to go out, and having had studied urban ecology for a 10-year period, I was ready to go out and smell, taste, and touch and the human footprint at a global continental scale. And so I went on this cycling journey. From My intention was to ride from New York City all the way down to the southern tip of South America, Tierra del Fuego, to
Right.
experience qualitatively the human footprint, right? To see, taste, and touch, see nature and urban interact, and to see that um, uh, at a global scale. And so, 2019 October, I set off from the Bronx Zoo um, and started riding, and rode from New York through all of the states, Mexico, Belize. I ultimately arrived in Belize, flew to Colombia because the Darien Gap is
Yeah.
this really difficult traverse that you really can't easily logistically get through, and then continued to ride down through South America. And then it was 2020,
Oh,
and the pandemic was exploding, and I made it to Chile. I rode my bike down to Chile. I took a couple buses during a couple sections. um, but over the course of 5 months, I rode the equivalent of three Tour de France's, fully self-supported, with a 90-pound bicycle with panniers, camping half of the time, solo. And it was somewhere around 7,000 miles, and somewhere in the neighborhood of 500,000 feet of climbing
mhm.
over the course of this 5 month period, and like 800 hours of riding. So, and was riding somewhere between 25 and 45 hours every week,
Week.
and which is like more than pro tour riders. Pro tour
More than
riders,
most people do in a month.
yeah, pro tour riders might ride, let's say 10 to 25 hours,
Hmm.
maybe pushing a little bit past that occasionally for an overload. But I was riding like 25 to 45 hours
Right.
every week. So but it was slow, of course. Lots of zone two, guys, like 100% zone two.
And that's why you're so fit.
I actually just looked back at my heart rate distribution data for that time block, and out of 800 hours of cycling, my heart rate was over 80% of max, like 6 hours,
The
or
first day. That was
yeah,
it. After that, it never goes up again.
because it was a matter of survival. When you're riding for 8 hours every day, you just can't do high intensity work. You
Right.
have to just keep it in check all the time. So COVID happened. I'm literally I arrive. I'm crossing the border from the Altiplano of Bolivia into Chile on March 10th,
Mm.
2020, they literally are like not letting me, they're not letting me in, actually. I almost was not allowed in to Chile. They eventually let me into Chile. And then 2 days later, it was March 13th. That was the day that, everybody got sent home and it was like work from home and total lockdown.
And you'll come back in a week
Yeah.
and another
Fortunately,
week and another week.
exactly. Another week, another week.
Yeah.
Fortunately, I had a friend in South America, in Chile at that time, and so I was able to stay with them for a couple days, and then evacuated
Yeah.
because Chile was in a shutdown as well. I came back. I went back to work at the Wildlife Conservation Society, ran a 100% virtual mentorship program
Wow.
for students that summer. That was an intensely emotional experience. Um, you know, the I was working with high school students in New York City, and yeah, it was a tough time at that time. And on about when that was happening, Coach Greg Wagoner, who was
Yes.
everybody knows Coach Greg, who was Matt's coach, Matt's own cycling coach. Coach Greg and I have done a lot of mountain biking over the years. Coach Greg brought me into the fold here. I joined up with Team Wilpers about that time, and slowly this has become a larger piece of my overall practice. And I've been now coaching fairly full time for 5 years. I still am a consultant as an ecologist and as a program evaluator. And so, like many of us, I wear a bunch of different
Lots
hats.
of hats. Yeah. So bike touring, so when I was turning 40, I had this desire to ride across the country and I didn't make it happen timing wise because of snow and the Rockies and everything. And I have a little OCD. So I was like, oh, I'll do it at 45. And then 50 came and 55 came and now 60 is coming and I still haven't ridden across the country. But I've chunked away a few weeks at a time in many of the
Nice.
states around the United States. And I've toured all over the world as well. And I always tell folks when you're touring self-supported, it's not really about the bike at all. It's about the adventure and problem solving and meeting people and getting to know the cultures and doing it at a speed where you get to enjoy everything. You're not in a car, you're not isolated. And would you agree with that?
100%. 100%. My average
You know,
speed
you're
for 5 months. Yeah, I have all the Training Peaks data. I mean, it's still, I'm a scientist, so
yeah,
I do love data. I don't let myself get, I don't let myself get, I don't allow my emotions to be tied to data, but
yeah,
I'm very interested in data. And because it's a fairly objective assessment of what actually occurs. But yeah, at any rate, yeah, my average speed was a little less than 10 miles an hour for 800 hours, right?
right.
And there were certainly days, for example, um, when I left Lima and rode to Cusco, where Machu Picchu is. A lot of people probably
Mm-hmm.
are familiar with Machu Picchu. Lima is the capital of Peru, and it's on sea level. It's right on the Pacific Ocean there. And Cusco is in the Andes Mountains up at 12, 15,000
Oh,
feet.
that's a big climbing day.
It's well, so in it actually took 2 weeks to ride there. So, but basically, you go from the ocean and it's literally a 15,000 foot climb from
Mm-hmm.
Lima to get up to, where you start to kind of oscillate.
Right.
And it literally took uh uh it was 2 entire days of nonstop climbing. And then on the third morning, I was able to finally get over it because, I'm riding. So those days I rode like 6 to 8,000 feet
Mm-hmm.
vertical nonstop with a 90-pound bicycle
Right.
going 3, 4 miles per hour the
Trying to keep
entire
the
time.
bike from tipping over because at that speed, that much weight doesn't handle well.
It can be a little, it can be, especially with a really heavy bike like that,
Mm-hmm.
but it can be a little bit dicey. But I had a lot of hours on the saddle already at that point. So it was good. But you just settle into that gear and you just hold your pace and you just crawl your way up that mountain.
Hmm.
One pedal
And you
stroke at a
think about
time.
benchmarks as you go or landmarks as you go. It's yeah. Um, would you do something like this again?
Well, logistically, as you were pointing out, it's difficult.
Yeah,
I think it would be logistically challenging for me to take a 5 to 6 month period of time off at this
yeah,
point. I was able to get a sabbatical at that time, and it was able to work. I was 35 at the time,
yeah,
34, 35. And so I doubtful that I will be able to take that much time off
yeah.
again anytime soon, but maybe as retirement,
Don't you want
come.
to go back and pick up in Chile and
I
finish?
I would very much like to go back down to Chile and to do some riding down there and get down to South America, all the
Yeah.
way down to Tierra del Fuego. And certainly, the last couple of years after COVID, obviously international travel was a whole new world.
Hmm.
So we'll see. We'll see. I'm sure I'll get
Yeah,
down there at some point. Yeah.
yeah.
But I still love doing shorter rides. Like you can do an overnight or a
Right,
couple nights or a week. And, those things are still quite enjoyable for
right.
me. There's something about getting on your bike. So often we get on our bike and we do a loop, right? And
Hmm.
it's like, oh, I'm coming back, but to like put everything on your bike and be like, I'm not coming back to this spot. Like I'm
Right.
I'm leaving here and I'm going. There's something about that is it's
Well, it's very empowering.
it is yeah to have that self-sufficiency, right, to have
Yeah.
everything right there and to just go.
Hmm.
It's
And
freeing.
scary. I mean, I will say it is every emotion
A
that you can
lot of emotion.
experience when you're touring. But
Yeah.
yeah, but I often think that I woke up in point A and I'm going to point B and I'm getting there by myself. And I always think about places I've driven and they seem like a long way. And it's like, wow, I just rode my bike this place where I've done most of the West Coast. And I tend to leave from JetBlue cities. So I've done like Rochester to Portland and Rochester to Minneapolis and Boston to Hickory, South North Carolina, and that kind of thing. And it's like, wow. And people are always amazed when they speak with you. They're like, you did this on a bike? Are you carrying a gun? Are you afraid? You're all alone? All the questions. It's like, yeah, I feel like a badass. But
Heck
um,
yeah.
yes. So let me ask you the transition to coaching. Often when I tour, I do it because there's something going on in my life that I'm thinking about. And I always hope I have this epiphany, and I never do. Actually, you always have epiphanies at the moment you don't think you will, right? But I always think, okay, I can solve this problem. I can overcome this challenge, whatever it is, when I'm out on my bike and I have endless time to think. And I will say, my first few tours, we didn't have smartphones, we didn't have Wi-Fi everywhere, we didn't have
Mhm.
access to data. So I went out for 3 weeks on my first tour, and I would go to the library once a week and just check email. um, the good old days,
The
right?
good old
I had
days.
a
Yeah.
map and a highlighter. I literally showed up in Syracuse, New York, and bought a map at the gas station and knew kind of where I was going to go, but I didn't know how I was going to get there. It's a little different now that we're connected, but did you have an epiphany on this trip, or multiple epiphanies, or what was the emotional, the life-changing aspect of this tour?
Yeah, it's interesting. I certainly was embarking on this journey for personal growth
Yeah,
reasons. Selfishly,
yeah,
like my feeling is that to be the best for those around you in the world, you need to do some of your own searching for yourself. And we need to put ourselves first.
put our oxygen mask on first, as they
Yeah,
say on
we,
the plane, right?
if we're not fed, healthy, happy, and well, how can we turn that around and
Mm-hmm.
be part of a global society, a local community, and so on. So part of it certainly was it was very much a personal journey in that way, and also and a learning journey. As I said, I wanted to learn, academically about the footprint of humanity at this large scale, and then personally, I was doing some exploring as well. And I would say that I came to, I like to talk about sort of like three key like lessons. I mean, there's like infinite lessons, but
Yes.
three of them I think are of value, particularly value. And the first one is we're all sharing the same roads, you know? I mean, like we all get up in the morning and put our pants on, or skirt or whatever it is. We eat some breakfast and, we try to make some money, have some friends, some family, try to be happy. We're all just sharing the same roads, trying to understand this life and this world and fit ourselves into it.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's good to have, everybody's on a struggle of some kind. And
Right.
so it's good to remember that. It's good to lead with a little bit of empathy with everybody because we could all use a little bit of it. We're all sharing the same roads. That's my
Mm-hmm.
first lesson. My second lesson is that a moment of suffering is just that,
A
right?
moment.
A moment.
Yeah.
We're on this earth for, I turned 40 this year. So, you can do the math on seconds and minutes and how many seconds and minutes and hours and days that is. And whenever we're doing an interval, wherever we're experiencing an emotional turbulent time, whenever there's pain of some kind, it's usually not forever.
Right.
It's usually a relatively short moment. And so the second lesson pertains to remembering that, there is an ebb and flow to life, and there are times when we're going to be suffering,
Mhm.
and it's probably going to be there for a period of time, and then it will not be there. So,
And that's a very good analogy to riding bikes. You do a long
absolutely,
ride and you will experience every emotion you can imagine.
every motion
You
along the
love
way.
riding and you hate riding, and you're filled with joy and pain and sorrow and all of those things.
And maybe that 15% grade is really difficult for a minute, but it's going to flatten out and it's
Hmm.
going to be more enjoyable, you
Right.
know? And so a moment of suffering is just that. And then my third one really encompasses these other two and perhaps is the single most important lesson, which is that around every corner, there will be another mountain to climb. So the most important mountain is the one within,
Ooh.
right? So really, it all comes down to the way that you're thinking about things. We can have power within, you can be a prisoner in a cell and be free in your mind.
Hmm.
You can be the most powerful person in the world
Hmm.
and be a prison in your mind, you
Right.
know? So, I believe that the mental the mental aspect is the single most important thing that we need to be focused on. There will always be another challenge out there.
Hmm.
You always want to hit another couple watts. You're always going to want to get up the next few miles. And those things are good because they are things along the journey that help us with our mental journey. But we should never forget that inside is the most important thing, and those external things just help us with that mental journey.
I'm trying to decide if you should write Hallmark cards or be a professor or
Well, I have some
administer,
of that. I certainly have
minister
some of
of
that
biology.
professorial background,
Yeah.
for sure. So,
Yeah. Well, I wrote these bullet points. We may find them on a t-shirt later. My only good one is more is not more, or more is not better, more is more. Um, Anyways, tell me about your role with Team Wilpers. What do you do?
So with Team Wilpers, I'm a coach. I'm a one-on-one coach. I have a bunch of athletes that I work with. My approach to coaching is athlete centered. I
Mhm.
believe that all athletes come, there are many ways to skin a cat.
Yeah.
We are all on our own journeys, and my approach is to join you as an athlete on your journey and together move forward, together create our philosophy for progressing and trying to reach the goals that you've set for yourself. And certainly, I'm interested in longevity and wellness, and um, performance helps us get to those things.
Hmm.
And so, I'm always interested in meeting athletes where they are and using, what they existing knowledge that they have to help them expand their knowledge about themselves, about cycling,
Hmm.
about training, about lifestyle, and to move that forward in a way that can make them the best person that they can be, as healthy and well and happy, knowing that there's some oscillations on the journey, of course.
Right. It is. Do you have a typical client?
I work with athletes, so
Stumped you on one almost.
well, yeah, no, I'm always well, two things. A deer just walked by
Okay.
outside my window, which I was like,
So the
oh,
deer stumped you.
there's a deer. And then secondly, a typical, I'm careful to say, like, I, I don't know that there is any, as a, I'm also a social scientist, and
Hmm.
so you know we there's so much variation in people, and so people are all over the place, and I don't know that either I have a typical athlete. No, I'm
Well,
not.
I think the common factor is having chemistry with their coach. And I think, anybody, especially these days with AI, anybody can write a training program and anybody can motivate, I guess. But having that chemistry, so finding the personality of somebody who you click with, I think is really, really important. So I imagine there are definitely people who are on an intellectual level going to find Jason to be an awesome coach. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and again, whether if you're in, I'm into data.
Yeah.
I really believe in, you know, there are so many different facets, but I think what you're saying, my approach, my coaching mentoring philosophy is a relational mentoring
Hmm.
philosophy. It's a bi-directional relationship.
Right.
What I was saying is we each have things to bring to the table, and I learn from each of my athletes, right? I'm a consummate learner. I have a growth mindset in that way, and I like my athletes to be,
Hmm.
thinking that way too, certainly. But I don't think I have a typical athlete. I work with athletes from across the spectrum. Whatever you're interested in, I'm I'm an explorer. And so
Yeah.
athletes come to me. Sometimes they're like, "Oh, I'm interested in this." And I'm like, "Oh, I don't know anything about that actually. So let me take a step back from that and tell you, hey, I'm not sure about that. Let me go do some of my research and then come back and maybe we can have a conversation and move forward, and that's part of that bi-directional relationship. I don't know everything.
I know. Well, and
Far
it's okay to
from
refer
it.
people out too. I've had lots of folks who I'm like, yeah, I don't think I'm your girl, even though I like you. And but I think there's a coach that might be better suited to what you're doing. So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, it takes two to tango for
Yeah.
sure. I do believe it is our role as coaches to try to meet an athlete where they are.
Hmm.
Um, so, and
Yeah.
So
same thing as a bike fitter. There are folks who are complicated medical cases, and I'm like, I can refer you to somebody who does medical bike fit. And that's probably a better choice for you. Or for years, I felt like I didn't have the same experience in triathlon fit that I had in road fit. And I did go to school and learn more, but I just didn't have the eye for it because I didn't see it enough. And I had to improve that skill set before I felt comfortable not referring people out. I was like, yeah, this was not my thing. So now it's my thing. But let me ask you a question. You rode Lehigh in Cappy
I
Grand
did
Fondo last year.
twice. I've ridden it twice, I believe.
Okay. So we have some folks going. Any tips for Lehigh?
Oh man, there are some steep pitches in
Yeah.
there. So what I would say is it like this week?
It's next weekend, I think.
Next
Yeah.
weekend.
And too late to buy new gearing, probably.
Yeah, there's not too much training to be done between now and then,
Right.
obviously. Certainly your discussion about climbing last week is appropriate. There's no sustained, really sustained climbs. It's a lot of punchy
East
climbs.
Coast is very punchy. That's
Yeah.
my impression from riding there versus here.
Super punchy. So, yes, yeah, in general, definitely East Coast versus West Coast, much more punchy. And by punchy, we mean steeper
Short,
grades,
steep.
short,
Yeah.
steep grades. So I think one of the key things to remember with punchy grades and oscillating terrain is to get to maintain. You want to maintain as much speed and momentum on those downs when you see a hill in front of you.
Yeah.
I know that
without doing too much work.
Without doing too much work. Yeah. So you want to get it into that big chain ring on the front, the little guy in the back, and use some of that force pedal to like really try to get some acceleration at the bottom of that hill and really keep that force going into the hill so you can get as much momentum, right? Because a lot of these pitches are steep at the get-go and then they kind of like taper off. So if you can really get, 25, 35 miles an hour, like coming down that hill safely, right? As much as possible in that big gear and really pull it up and maintain that momentum. And as you're going up, you're going to be in the big gear in the front and the smallest in the back. And then you want to start to work yourself through those.
You mean you don't immediately go to your granny gear? Come on.
So that's right. So using your right hand, you want to start to, if you're, as long as you're not British, you're going to use that right hand, right?
That's just brakes. It's not shifting.
Oh, right. That's right. That's right. So you want to start to work that cassette into some easier gears, maintaining your good, comfortable cadence, probably 85 to 95, wherever you're at. And then as that cadence, so you're shifting. And then once you're getting sort of halfway, 2/3 of the way through, then you throw it into that granny gear. You might even need to go down a gear or two to maintain that perfect cadence. And then use, some of your cadence to get over the rest of the climb. So I think maintaining as much momentum is, I think, the number one most important thing, and trying to be smooth with your shifting as you're kind of transitioning into going to that uphill.
Yeah.
And then, like sometimes if it's continuing to be really steep, like you were saying, you may be forced to get out of your saddle and do a couple pedal strokes standing up. And if you haven't been doing that standing up stuff yet, I echo everything that Lorri said in the climbing discussion. You have got to get that tool in your toolbox, because it's critically important to be able to stand up and put a couple pedal strokes down to get over an extra steep bit, because the moment of suffering is just that, a moment. It's going to end, it's not.
And then there'll be another one.
And then there'll be another one. Yes.
Yeah. Rollers. They call them rollers. And I'm like, not if I'm not able to roll back up. That's not a roller. It's just a series of short, hard climbs. But yeah, it's a great event. And I've done the Greenville one, and I've also done the gravel race out here in Merced, and Hinkepi puts on a great event.
It's
So
beautiful. Yeah, the
yeah,
scenery is beautiful. The route is
enjoy, eat the
beautiful.
cookies,
Very few
nutrition,
cars.
hydration, pacing, all those things are super important.
Love it.
Don't
Love
panic
it.
train this week. You're not going to
No,
gain or lose fitness this week. Just maintain your rhythm. So yeah. Okay, I've got the 3 takeaways. I have a question, and I'm going to ask your opinion on this from Brittany. And I don't know how to pronounce your last name, Brittany. I apologize. But she was asking about benchmarks. So the last time we did a climb challenge, we used one of Christine Dercolet's classes. It was Palomar 2, which is a steady climb. And as I was mentioning to Jason before we started, I've been trying to share with the group other ways to benchmark fitness beside just FTP. And so doing a benchmark climb, like I have a climb near me that's a 9-mile dirt climb that I use throughout the year just to see where my fitness is. And so we did a steady climb last time. This time we're using one of Christian Vandevelde's classes, which is a simulation of Alpe d'Huez. So it's not a steady climb, and it has a little bit of recovery in it. It's a series of switchbacks, obviously. So the short hard and then the long extended. So she was asking, how the heck do we benchmark this? It's different. And I was talking about objective versus subjective ways to benchmark. So things like, right, the measurables, the data, what's my total output or my average watts, my average speed, or looking at how do I feel when I do this? What do you think about that? Is using a benchmark as something that's not a steady climb? How do you
absolutely.
benchmark your clients?
Yeah, absolutely. I think using any sort of like a local spot that you go and are riding all the time, or one particular ride that you
Mm-hmm.
look at, whether it be just a workout or what have you, I think all of those things are appropriate. Um, for different athletes, I have different benchmarks, right?
Yeah.
Because different athletes have different preferences, and abilities, and different athletes have different ways that they think about things, they have access to different things, right? So
Mm-hmm.
all of those things come into play, um, with doing benchmark rides. Something.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I think that's great with um,
Now, how does a data guy like you use something like RPE, rating of perceived exertion?
RPE. I mean, RPE is so I assign, I prescribe some rides by RPE, I prescribe some rides by heart rate, and I prescribe some rides by power.
Ah,
And I believe that we are the best athlete when we can use those 3 things together,
mm-hmm.
because you're right, we have objective measures of performance in speed and watts and power and kilojoules. We have a physiological um, indice for
Like
what's
my heart rate
your
response.
your heart rate, kind of like what's going on inside the body, what's the engine doing inside, not the output, not the speed and the power, kind of what's going on inside, and
Mm-hmm.
then the perceive, like how am I perceiving this? And so when I'm working with my athletes, I'm looking at the 3 of those things on every single ride, on every single thing that they do, at a weekly, daily, exercise, globally level. So
Mm-hmm.
those 3 things are critical. I talk about RPE all the time with my athletes, and um, ultimately, I believe that it's most important to be using RPE.
Right. It's interesting though. I had a little bit of a break from the bike in the last month. Um, and I went from a pretty high level of fitness to feeling like I have nothing right now. And I went out yesterday, and it was the first time I'd done a longer ride in a couple of weeks. And it was very warm. It was warmer than it usually gets here. It was in the mid 80s. And I felt like it was super hard, even though I know it shouldn't have been. And my heart rate didn't really respond, which was also interesting. After a break, sometimes it doesn't. My power was way down. I was like, oh man, the first ride, always so hard. Not going anywhere with that, but just as an example. But I have another question for you that I was just thinking about. I'm reading and hearing a lot about respiratory training And do you have any knowledge of that at this point, or that'll be your next thing to learn, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, so
So gauging respiration rate.
yeah. So what well maybe we could, we first of all, we know training zone, like I'm just thinking about how to tackle this. So maybe
Yeah.
at the highest level, um, in the laboratory, uh, the training zone distributions are based on one of the ways that they are determined is based on ventilatory thresholds,
Mhm.
VT1 and VT2. These correspond to your breathing. So breathing is extremely important and definitely is tied to your heart rate, and your perceived exertion.
And your processing of lactate and all of that. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. Um, so definitely we talk about breath in terms, and I know that Stephen Seiler is doing some research right now on you integrating, and I know some of the pro tour teams are starting to integrate some of that um, respiration rate monitoring into some of their practices. Um, and I believe that they were saying like once you hit kind of there's like this point. I think it was like 85% of max or
Mhm.
something like that is like that's it. That's like a key turning point. Effectively like VO2 max or FTP. Like once you go over that point, it's like you are going to be increasingly fatigued.
Right.
So yeah, so I have not integrated. I don't have anybody that's measuring
No,
breath right now yet.
but a
So
lot of the big coaches are starting to experiment with it. It's going to be the next thing, I think.
absolutely, yeah,
Mhm.
it very well could be. And so it's certainly interesting. And in terms of ventilatory thresholds, like it's when you do VO2 max testing, right? You see respiration
Right.
as one of the key indicators, and when you're interpreting a VO2 max test, you can look at respiration, and that's what gives you the VT
Well, and
turn
I
point.
think the challenge has been we haven't had an onboard way to do that outside the lab.
Right.
And so if we can measure based and correlate respiratory rate to ventilatory thresholds. Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that a lot of folks don't understand is we have these ranges. We'll segue into training zones in a minute. We have these ranges, and there's a very big difference between being at the bottom of one zone and the top of that same zone. Or, yeah, so it'll be interesting. I predict you will be the next person to start using this.
Well, you know what, I was, as a trained scientist, I also like to be, and as somebody who has studied humans myself, I've used human subjects for research. I also have allowed myself to be a guinea pig, of studies. And back in, maybe like 7 years ago, I was part of a study out of Columbia University as a participant, as a commuter. I was a bike commuter. I would commute from the Brooklyn to the Bronx on my bike, and I actually wore like these sensors that collected particulate matter and determined the amount of environmental
Uh,
exposure I was experiencing. And I was wearing one of these, bio shirts that
mhm.
measured my respiratory rate and my volume and determined the amount of environmental pollution I was being exposed to. Because as you exercise,
Mhm.
you're breathing more, you have a higher volume
Think
of
about that
respiratory
often.
exchange. And the question becomes, does the environmental exposure, the is are you getting more benefit from exercising in a polluted environment,
Right.
or is the exposure, the increased exposure because of the pollution in an environment, potentially causing net
Harm.
negative impact
Yeah.
on. um, and so this was an interesting study. It turns out that the highest amount of pollution that I was experiencing on my bicycle commute was on the bridges because
Oh,
you had all of these cars that were
hmm.
sitting on the bridges early in the morning when there's like no wind around, and there
Hmm.
would be all this environmental, extra pollution coming out of the cars, and you have to ride your bike up the hill.
Right.
You're
You're
breathing
going
a little
harder.
bit more. Yeah, so that's when you're most likely to get the most
I
exposure.
always think of it at intersections. And one of the nice technologies now, I think, is beside electric cars, where we don't have those emissions, but a lot of the cars will turn off. So they're not producing emissions while they're at a stop after X number of seconds or whatever.
Right. I
Um,
think that,
yeah.
and I think that's standard like in Europe, that's like
Hmm.
all cars do that, you
Yeah.
know?
But it definitely, I don't drive my car out into the country to go ride my bike. I ride through whatever area I'm in, and that may be an urban area, or I commuted for many years as well. There
I
was
can
a,
say I can say though that the results suggest that riding the bike is still healthier.
oh
Like
yeah,
no matter what the exposure levels are not high enough, either whether you're riding, commuting by walking or commuting by bike, it's still better to be a commuter from a
yeah,
health standpoint.
yeah.
Um,
It's also, I think there's huge mental benefit to that too. We were talking about the first time you ride from point A to B, and this was before I was a coach. I was working at Charles Schwab, and I lived about 22, I could tell you exactly, 21.65 miles from my office. And I started bike commuting as a way to get more training. And there was something awesome about, I'd start in the dark, and you get to your office and you're like, I've accomplished something already. It makes me feel awesome. And that to me is one of the reasons why I coach, right? Cycling improves our self-esteem, makes us better people, better employers or employees or spouses or parents. And there's something very empowering about that, about doing the thing and succeeding at the thing you didn't think you could.
yeah,
So, yeah.
for
Um,
sure.
let's talk for a minute about training zones, because I know you have some opinions on this as well. And I would say a couple of observations watching everyone's graphs this week as we are in an endurance week. As we know from um, previous discussions of this, when we ride an endurance ride on the Peloton world, zone 3 isn't really endurance. Zone 3 is pushing that envelope a little bit. And then when you start riding at the top of zone 3, you're really pushing yourself into a different place. So I would say try to honor your zones. We want accurate zones to begin with. So that's where our FTP test does come in handy. We still have some time to test. We have a nice easy week this week. So you could test today, you could opt out of tomorrow's ride and test, you could test on Sunday. So if you haven't tested in a while, get some accurate training zones. Some of you took that 2 week break to do a rest and test, and that was great. But don't overpower your zones. Why is that important, Jason? Why don't we want to ride harder than what's prescribed in general?
Yeah, I mean, well, certainly in terms of, I mean, the answer depends. It depends. It
Yeah,
depends.
it does.
So,
It's a coach's
you
number one
know,
answer.
and as a scientist too, I try to be very careful with what I say. It depends, but if it, I think the key issue is that we're always, as you said, managing how much fatigue, how
Mm-hmm.
much stress and strain our body is under, right? And if you're riding, uh, in general, if you're doing more, I never, almost never prescribe more than two challenging rides in a week, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, if you're riding 5 days a week, you three of those rides, at least three of those rides, need to be like pretty easy uh,
Mm-hmm.
on the regular basis.
So
Otherwise,
when we consider a challenging ride high intensity, so like an interval workout or a tempo workout or duration, does that fall into challenge?
yeah, absolutely. Durate, yeah, for
So
sure.
a
Yeah.
long ride, which in the Peloton world, we don't do much that we would consider long, but it's long in proportion to what else we're doing.
Right, 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 right. So, um, it depends on your entire training plan, right?
Right.
Like So for the person that's doing 5 rides per week on Peloton between 30 minutes and an hour, maybe 30 minutes and an hour and a half,
Hmm.
um, at least, on average, at least 3 of those rides should be pretty easy,
Yeah.
and um, not more than 2 of them on a regular basis should be hard.
Right.
And you can ask yourself, at the end of the workout, that's where that RPE comes into play,
Hmm.
the ride, your endurance rides that are prescribed endurance rides should be like a 3, they should not be hard.
Right.
They should never be hard. Um, some endurance rides are going to be where, if we're using like, if we are doing some of that tempo work and trying to push that, sometimes we do push those endurance rides up to
Hmm.
that higher level. But on balance, if we're doing like 5 rides a week on average, like we just described, at least 2 or 3 of those need to be very easy ride, like
Right.
relatively easy rides. And so, yeah, I think that's pretty clear.
Good. I
Yeah,
figure if enough people say this enough times in different ways,
yeah,
eventually we'll understand. The challenge is we're not creating any additional fitness, but we're creating fatigue, which
that's right.
also means, your other workouts are not going to have the same value. So yeah.
So the what I would say is that you can do endurance work and include some zone 2 and zone 3, right? You can do a ride like a power zone endurance that has zone 2 and zone 3. Those can be endurance rides, because you have a distribution of those intensities.
Hmm.
I think, as you've said, where we get into trouble is if we're just like at the top of zone 2 and the top of zone 3, then on average, that's, the power is higher and we're a little bit higher. So
Yeah.
one of the what I like to tell my athletes is, I have a pretty de depending on the athlete, you know, when I'm saying endurance rides, between 78% and 85% of heart rate max is the absolute, depending on the athlete, that
Hmm.
is what I say is like, don't go above that, right? Female athletes who tend to have anatomically smaller hearts, right, tend to have higher heart rates.
Hmm.
And so when we talk about heart rate, sometimes people get really concerned. Oh, this person has this heart, this person has that heart. So I'm careful when I talk about heart rates using a relative number, percent of max,
Right.
and and there are some sex specific differences there, biological sex specific differences that we need to take into account. Um, and some fitness specific components to that too,
And just some genetic anomalies.
and genetic anomalies.
There are hummingbirds
Absolutely.
in this world.
Yes, 100%, 100%. But in my experience, if you're over 85% of heart rate max, that you're definitely you're out of endurance territory
Right.
for sure. And once you're starting to get to 80%, 78, 80%, you're starting to get into that transition depending on who you are as an
Hmm.
individual.
Yeah.
So that's kind of another guideline. So you can do some zone 3, to push a little bit. And if you're outside, for example, you can't just ride, your power jumps all over the place.
You need
It's
better gearing. That's what I
it's
always say. Ride my
it's
gravel bike because I can climb anything in zone 2.
climb anything in zone 2, but still, like over here where I live, it's punchy. I go out my
Yeah.
door, I ride 5 miles, I do 500 feet of climbing.
Right.
And your power outside is going to oscillate constantly.
Yeah.
So saying, "Oh, I'm just going to stick at, zone 2 power here," is not going to work outside. So we use RPE and heart rate so that we can step back a little bit from the instantaneous performance production and
Hmm.
and say, "How am I feeling? What's going on physiologically?" Because
Right.
what
What's
we're
the intention of this ride?
yes,
I
because
think a
when
lot
we're
about intention.
intention, yeah, when we're thinking about fatigue, we're thinking about what's physiologically, am I physiologically getting fatigued? And
Right.
certainly, like you said, if your heart rate isn't responding, that could be an indicator. If your heart rate is vastly different from what it typically is at a particular power output, that's an indicator that you could be fatigued.
Right.
So, yeah, there's a bunch of stuff that goes into that.
Yeah. Well, good. Good, good, good. Um,
Maybe, Lori, one other thing to add to that too.
yeah.
In terms of benchmarks, FTP tests, I believe that there is value for an FTP test for certain people in certain times. And I also believe, sometimes when we go into FTP tests, we're like, I'm gonna like, we go into the
Win
FTP
it.
test, we say, I'm like literally gonna do 100% of what I can do for 20 minutes, right?
Mhm.
But I also, one of the things that I like to do with some of my athletes is say, let's just do a 20-minute effort, right?
Right.
Let's do a 1 by 20 minute at a sustainable intensity that
Right.
you, right? And you can get a lot of information from that. If you tell somebody to do a 20-minute tempo effort, right? And they're in those last, 10 minutes and it's just like, you can, or if heart rate is starting, you can get a lot of information from doing a 20-minute effort at a
Yes.
sustained, relatively high, but not crushingly high intensity. So
Yeah.
I do think, if we kind of step back from the 20-minute effort as a test, there's also some really good value in that.
Hmm. And there's other ways to test when you're not formally testing. I can go out and in the middle of my hill climb, I can do a 20-minute effort and I
Right.
can come up with some good data. So
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, a lot of athletes have testing anxiety, and
Right.
so, like I won't I will have something that I'm intending to look at, and
Hmm.
I won't
And you
even
won't
say
tell them it's a test.
I won't tell them anything about
Yeah.
that it's a test.
I'm not a good tester inside. I'm fine outside. But you put me on an inside test and I blow it every time. Even though I can help other people. Anyways, we're gonna wrap. This was we could talk a lot. A couple of other notes about the challenge, since that's why we're here. It's on the Team Wilpers platform, as you know now, and uh, the challenge will be released each week on Thursdays. There's a PDF with clickable links. The free option is in the Team Wilpers Facebook group, so you can find that there as well. You can join All Access for it's cost of a cup of coffee, basically $9.95 a month, and then you get the strength, you get the mobility, you get all the other plans that we have available. Someone had asked this week, we have a road to 100-mile plan, which is great for our folks who have a goal of riding a century this week. So click around there, and there's also some other member discounts and options for us. Join your chat groups on the Facebook group. It's great. It's social. You can train together. Use the hashtag Team Wilpers Cycling. So, any parting words, Jason?
Oh man,
I
you
know.
know, I think my always like I think the thing that I think about most always is, training is it's an exercise in balance,
Yeah.
we're there's so many tensions in life, and training, my view for training has always been, training supports my life. Training is intertwined in my life. It never has control of me. I don't let
Right.
my training control me. I control my training. And, with good training, with balanced training, with consistent training, we can be healthy and strong and be able to do anything we want to do physically.
Hmm.
And that is the absolute key in my view.
I agree. I think the other thing that's really important to look at is training is not one day, it's not one week, it's not a month. Yesterday I'm doing my riding and I'm thinking, you blew it. And I was like, no, you didn't. It's the trend, it's the lifetime. You have a lifetime of fitness here. And you took a little break because you needed a little break because there was other stress in the life. And so we don't lose fitness overnight. We don't gain fitness overnight, but it is the consistency that we have throughout our lifetime that makes the difference. So,
100%.
and on
100%.
that note, Jason, thank you so much. I'll
My
pop some
pleasure.
links in the Facebook group so folks can find you. I really appreciate your time today and pivoting on over to Zoom when I failed yet again on YouTube.
No problemo. It's been super fun, Lorri.
I
Hopefully I
know.
can come back again sometime here.
Absolutely. Hopefully we'll get to ride bikes. So,
I hope so. I hope so.
okay. Have a great day.
Thanks. You too.